In the last chapter, we learned from the people of Brannock that King Bigus had been imprisoning any who dared to oppose his tyrannical rule. Sneaking into the deadly Brannock castle through a hidden entryway, we battled scores of Red and White Rose Knights to eventually confront their creator, Bigus's despicable ally, Guilty. After defeating Guilty and taking a brief respite with our old friend Leonardo, we entered Bigus's war room to find none other than Shannon above our injured father. During our father's escape, he challenged Shannon the moment she confronted him and mentioned our name, but Shannon managed to subdue him. Holding him hostage, she ordered that we do as we're told and continue down the path before us. Reluctantly following her demands and temporarily leaving our father in her grasp, we entered the adjacent throne room to finally come face to face with the Iron King himself. Upon his defeat, however, Shannon locked the doors behind us and continued to press us forward to the rooftop, where she gave us the Eltale book and confessed that our final test rested with Mammon. Mammon, who's still a mystery to us, is the one that orchestrated the events that led to Keltland's catastrophe 1,000 years ago. Using the elemental gems, we activate the Stone Circle's portal and open our eyes to the twisted world that Mammon created from our own treasured memories. This is the final segment of the Story Explained section of this series, and it's here we finally come face to face with Mammon and our destiny. Alongside the conclusion, we'll be returning to several small but key areas in the narrative we've held off to examine until the finale in order to more clearly elucidate the game's ending. The intent behind the series was to clearly organize the tapestry of Quest's events to unravel the story in the most logical way, and we'll conclude by observing the ending from this angle. Stepping through the Stone Circle, we'll enter a place only referred to as World of Mammon by our map. From the player's perspective, this area would appear to be little more than a cluster of reused areas and unused textures and objects, but I believe this couldn't be more incorrect. For what the World of Mammon is entirely depends on the one within it. It's not a part of Keltland, let alone Keltland's world, because it operates outside of it. It's not really a world at all. Its reality only exists as a twisted interpretation of one's memories and fears, creating a road that ultimately leads to Mammon. Let me explain this idea further on. As mentioned, progression through this section is achieved by revisiting many of the areas we've explored within the game. Some of the most noteworthy connections are Melroad and the Monastery, Kiliak's ship, and Glencoe Forest, stitched together by long stretches of roads swimming through the void. These exist in the World of Mammon because they're the roads that Brian discovered over the course of his journey, and these same roads now come together to take him to his final destination. However, this world is still within the creature Mammon's control, and many of these memories are twisted into, at best, strange, and at worst, nightmarish representations of themselves. Following the idea that this world is created from Brian's mind by Mammon's hand, I have a theory that the monsters we encounter here come from Brian's memories as well. What could be more deadly than what a young boy has only heard of in old stories passed down by the monks, or read in the dusty tomes within the monastery library? I like to believe that the Pale Riders, Spriggans, Judgments, and Pinheads are all creatures that came from fantastic and strange stories in Keltland's history, and that these are, literally, the most powerful beings Brian himself can conceive. I believe this is the best explanation as to why monsters can wander the halls of these familiar places. There aren't any points in the game that reference the World of Mammon, which ultimately leaves it open to the player's interpretation, but I feel this hypothesis cuts a deep impression for the final area of the game. It's a place that simultaneously feels like home, but also foreign. A realm crudely patched together and filled with fantastic, dangerous beasts that a child would fear. After all, no matter how many villains we defeat or victories we achieve, Brian is still just that, a child. The only segment that breaks the consistency of these ideas is the point where we encounter Epona one last time. This is the very last place someone might come to our aid, and from this point on, we're on our own. For that reason, she offers us one final rest before we face our destiny. But this begs the question, if we've explained that the World of Mammon is a world made from Brian's memories, how could any human besides Brian be here? To this, I'd argue that Epona isn't here with us, not literally anyway. While Epona no longer possesses the great magical strength from the Day of Grief, she is still an exceptionally talented magician with experience spanning 1,000 years, and likely knows many spells lost to the annals of time. Because of this, and considering that Epona has had a greater understanding of Brian's journey than anyone in the game, I believe she found a way to loosely control the image we have of her, having watched over us since we first obtained an elemental gem. If her quest mirrored ours whatsoever in the past, perhaps the chaotic world of Mammon isn't entirely new to her either, or perhaps it's something she, to a degree, even understands. So while the Epona before us is simply another fractured memory swirling in the whirlpool of our mind, the real Epona uses the shadow of herself to reach out to us one last time. After we rest, we'll continue through Mammon's Labyrinth until we enter a cold, undefinable room, with none other than Shannon awaiting us at its center. She explains that she was a puppet made from Mammon, with the sole purpose of leading us to our ultimate goal. She knew nothing of the real world or its people who are doomed to eventually die, but she doesn't understand how humans possess such strength despite this, and go on to shine so brightly. Is it the bounties provided by the elements that allow the humans to continue no matter their opposition? Is that the reason they continue to offer prayers to the spirits and thanks? She understands that she simply cannot understand, but continues to struggle with her inability to grasp the human spirit. She stops herself from questioning us any further, and explains that if we have the book and the magic stone, the jail key will open the way to Mammon. She bids us farewell, as holding the key transports us to Mammon's cage. I want to take a moment to dissect the latter of what she said, because it's often a point of contention among Quest's player base. G, A, O, and L, literally pronounced jail, is derived from the Middle English spelling of jail during the late 1700s and early 1800s. Over Quest's lifespan, many have pointed out that this is a typo, and I want to emphasize that not only is the spelling intentional, but it's an important point in connecting this moment to the Day of Grief. There are several points in the story where jail or prison is referenced. In fact, it's literally spelt J, A, I, and L when Elgin of Limeland told us Fargo was locked up inside the city's tower jail. I believe that using this more archaic form of jail in this circumstance is to further put emphasis on the time passed between the Day of Grief and where Brian stands now. This adds one final link in the chain of the events that occurred 1,000 years ago, a representation of Keltland's advancement from the times when cities such as Shamwood, built to mirror ziggurats and structures we found Chilf within, dotting the land. To put it plainly, it's one final reference to the millennium passed by since the Day of Grief, and a nod that this key likely originated from that point. What is most definitely an error in the translation is where Shannon highlights a magic crystal that needs to be used along with the book and the key. I believe that this was meant to reference the elemental gems and the opening of the stone circle, not that a magic crystal was needed to literally use the key. There is never any point in the game where emphasis is placed on a singular crystal, let alone one elemental gem in particular, which is why I conclude this to be an error. Regardless, once Shannon passes on the key, we'll enter the final area of the game, the end of roads. The boundless blanket of sky is dotted with hundreds of shining colored lights and cosmic trails, and within the center of it all is all there is. Ourselves, a short pathway, and a winged goliath floating within the center of the abyss. It watches us as we approach, silent in its docility, yet arms stretched out, almost welcoming. But once we're within the creature's reach, the beast begins to rumble as if recalling sound for the first time in a millennium. He begins to laugh. He claims he's happy to see us after a long wait. Because of the curse Epona cast on him, he's been locked within this prison for 1,000 years. Now though, his wait is over, and we're the ones that can set him free. He asks for wings, announcing that he will be free, and that his time has come once again. We've released him from his prison, and to show his gratitude, he won't let us suffer. After bellowing out laughter once more, the battle for the world begins. At last, now that we've discovered Mammon and listened to his dialogue, we can begin to piece together many of the events that we've left behind up until this point. These 3 sections are possibly the most important areas in the game to completely connect the story, these being examining Shilf, Lavar, and Epona, followed by Shannon and Mammon's relationship with one another, and ending on Mammon himself. First, let's flip back to Chapter 4 and examine Shilf. As a quick refresher, I hypothesized that Lavar wasn't the only one cursed by Epona, but while Lavar was bound to his eternal city, Shilf was bound to her temple. I also made a note that it was strange that the only reason she appeared after all this time was because she sensed the elemental gems. These ideas explain why she was unable to leave the temple, as well as why she only appeared then, as it was likely many archaeologists and miners had passed through that area before. Shilf was to Lavar what Shannon was to Bygis, in that she was a charismatic and manipulative agent of Mammon who tempted Lavar into using the book, the difference being that Shilf was human while Shannon is a puppet. In Keltland's history, we know that many of the old kingdoms waged war for control over the book, and I believe that Shilf was the temptress that created the idea that controlling this book was key to gaining great power. This gave Mammon 2 advantages. Not only would the book's mere existence create constant conflict within Keltland, but the one that eventually possessed the book would likely be one of the most powerful figures in Keltland, the perfect person for Mammon to corrupt. The reason that this is important is because I believe that the Eltale book is literally a window for Mammon to bind himself to the reader. If we recall Lavar's conversation, he vividly recounts what it felt like to be controlled by the book. He was filled with hate and contempt, and devoid of love and compassion. This is literally a mirror to Mammon. These emotions are constantly felt by Mammon and are reflected onto the reader, which in turn drives the readers to crave the destruction Mammon wants so desperately to unleash upon the world. Also, consider that the 4 elemental gems may grant the user tremendous magical strength on the offset of corrupting their souls, this corruption being a fragment of Mammon's influence. Splitting the book into gems wasn't only for Epona and the Great Spirits to create a barrier between Mammon and the book. It was because the strength granted to the book's wielder was so significant and so terrible that its mere existence was a cataclysm bound to occur once more. Thus, the Great Spirits sacrificed much of their power to create the elemental gems and quarter the book's power, making it much more difficult for the book to be readily used ever again. This leads to another question, however. Why didn't Epona and the Great Spirits attempt to destroy Mammon instead? We need to remember that their battle didn't take place with Mammon himself, but instead with Lavar, a wizard king of great power, made even more powerful by the Eltale book. I don't believe that Epona and the spirits ever directly confronted Mammon. The fallout resulted in creating the jail key and quartering the Eltale book's power, which cursed Mammon and kept him within a cage that fractured his ability to interact with Keltland. The stone circle's construction is one of the most important elements into creating a way to reach Mammon once more. By placing the elemental gems within the stone circle and holding the Eltale book, creates a literal door into the world of Mammon. I believe this was likely made by Guilty, along with Shannon, in order to create a way back to Mammon and break the curse that bound him from the book. After all, from what we can deduce, activating the elemental gems on the stone circle and bringing the Eltale book back within the world of Mammon allows one to use the jail key to open Mammon's prison. Recalling the beginning of the Story Explained section, the 4 elemental gems were granted to guardians while the Eltale book was locked deep within the monastery crypts, and the world continued to go by for 1,000 years. But Mammon was still very much alive, just severed off from the world he continued to hate, inhabited by the humans he was so jealous of, spurned by the very existence of life. The question is, what was Mammon doing during the millennium that passed by? Mammon understood a few things during his long contemplation. As he was cursed, his connection to the Eltale book was severed. Not only that, but the gems fragmented the book's power, so even if one had the book, it was nothing more than a locked door, mute of his magic. But within Mammon's cage, he still had the ability to perform magic, and I believe this is where Shannon was born. It's difficult to say if Shannon was created on Keltland or was sent there from within Mammon's jail, but we know for a fact that she was created from Mammon and carried out his will. Therefore, she knew that the Eltale book was likely within the monastery, and possessed the magic used to steal herself within the crypts and steal the book. Following this, she began to orchestrate the events that would, to a degree, repeat the events from 1,000 years ago. While kingdoms wouldn't battle over the Eltale book, Shannon would target those easily influenced by the prospect of the elemental gem's power. This is likely a two-part plan. While Shannon and Guilty began creating the stone circle that needed the elemental gems to create the door to Mammon's world, they would allow their chosen guardians of the elemental gems to wield their power and create chaos across the land. The result would be the same regardless of who wielded the gems. Keltland's strongest candidate would eventually come to possess all the gems, and Shannon would eventually guide them to the stone circle. It's likely that Shannon saw promise in King Bigus to wield a once again fully functional Eltale book to carry out Mammon's will, a mirror to why King Lavar was the best candidate 1,000 years ago as well. Regardless, assuming that King Bigus would eventually come to possess the 4 elemental gems, it would be possible to open the way to Mammon, and with the elemental gems upon the stone circle and the Eltale book returned to Mammon, this would produce the jail key needed to open Mammon's prison. This would reconnect Mammon to the Eltale book, which would then be returned to King Bigus, allowing Mammon to try once more to destroy the world. This time, however, he couldn't be stopped. The Great Spirits no longer possessed the strength after they sacrificed much of their power to create the elemental gems, and Epona wouldn't be a match for Mammon on her own. What no one expected was that a young apprentice spirit tamer from the peaceful, quiet Melroad, who'd never set a foot outside of his own village, would eventually come to defeat all of the elemental gems' new guardians, victorious over any obstacle that came between him and finding his father, taking him all the way into King Bigus's castle. It wasn't to save the world. All of this went over the young apprentice's head. Everything Brian did came from nothing more than the love he bore for his father, and the hope he carried with him across Keltland that he would find him one day. This purpose brought him all the way to the Iron King's war room, where Shannon stood above Brian's father, and this is the moment that changed everything. If it wasn't for this point, possibly the thesis behind the entire narrative, Brian's father would have been killed for challenging Shannon, and Brian would have likely failed in his quest. This is the point that I've been wanting to make throughout this entire series. Brian's father, having battled his way through countless rose nights, covered in wounds, was eventually stopped by Shannon. In this moment, Brian's father would have likely given up and returned to whatever cold cell waited for him to eventually become another experiment for Guilty. If Shannon hadn't mentioned the same thing we've heard time and time again, someone that looks very much like you came through here, it's in that moment she mentions our name, and without thinking, Lord Bartholomew prepares to throw his life away if it meant keeping this monster away from his son. It was a hopeless endeavor. The already wounded Lord Bartholomew didn't stand a chance against her and was quickly beaten. But it's here that Shannon can't bring herself to deliver the final blow. All of these years traveling across Keltland, working to achieve Mammon's goals, she couldn't understand why humans continued to work through their hardships, why they continued to struggle. And it's here all those questions begin to come full circle. What was happening right before her eyes that she couldn't see? It's simple. It was love. Quest 64 isn't solely a story about good versus evil. It's not just about going to an area to beat a boss, get a key item, then move on to the next area. It's not about lifting a curse from an ancient king, saving a kingdom from a brutal tyrant, avenging a great and noble lord, sailing to fantastic and strange places, protecting cities from waves of encroaching monsters, or preventing the economic collapse of an entire country. It's a story about the love shared between a father and his son. It's a story about how far we're willing to go for the people we care about, for what we care about. Shannon couldn't bring herself to kill Lord Bartholomew, and for the first time since she entered this world, she made her own choice, to wait for Brian to reunite with his father. It's likely that, if she had killed him, Brian would have lost his purpose, and any will he had to continue on. Remember, it's the only thing we've known about our protagonist through his entire story, and the only thing that's been driving him forward. In her own way, by making this decision, Shannon unknowingly played one of the most important roles in saving the world. Mammon is a beast of terrifying power. We know that, now, we're the only thing standing between him and the complete destruction of the known world, and with every attack, we can feel the weight behind it, the desperate need he embodies to complete his goal. But we didn't come this far to stop for anyone or anything, bandits, monsters, or kings. So we'll put everything into one final attack to put an end to this, to save everyone we've met during our travels, and for those that we were too late to save. In the middle of the universe, at the end of the final road, with one last wave of our staff, Mammon would falter and crumble before us. As his flesh begins to decay, he doesn't understand what's happening, what it feels like to die, as he begins to dissipate into the darkness that surrounds him. Life, that which he hated so much, would endure, as he slipped back into the darkness he sprang from. However, in his last moments, a kindness he doesn't deserve begins to grip him, a deep and endless sleep. In the end, Mammon would finally be free of the hate and jealousy that drove him, and in his own way, he did eventually fly from the cage that bound him. Everything around us begins to disappear as we're pulled back from the jail, Shannon standing before us. She can't explain why she's still here. She was bound to Mammon for all eternity, so she believes she should have been destroyed along with him. She questions whether it was our doing. Deep inside, she suspects she knew that we'd be triumphant. The power of life was always much greater than the forces of evil could ever obtain. Mammon was always jealous of humans. Overflowing with this power he was so desperate to snuff out, only knowing feelings of hate, pain, and overwhelming jealousy. She decides at that point that she'll travel the world and learn more about humans. She'll leave Keltland, hoping to meet as many people as she can during her journey. Perhaps in time, she'll find her own humanity. She hopes we can meet again, but until then, she gives us her undying thanks. With that, she bids us farewell. As the ending text rolls on screen, we learn that Keltland was reborn upon Mammon's defeat. New towns rose from their ruins, completely reborn, while those who had been injured were made whole again. The people are once again blessed with the warmth of fire, the wind's caress, cool water, and the fruits of the earth. If they walk hand in hand with these forces, they'll prosper forever. While few would know of the young spirit tamer that saved the world, it wouldn't matter. Glory, power, and fame were never meant to be the goal for this quest. Brian's reward would be something else, an entirely different road from the ones he'd taken before. Side by side with his father, he'd follow the road home. This concludes the Story Explained section. I hope you'll join me for a short, final epilogue video that puts an end to my Case for Quest 64 series. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you then.